Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It's good to be with you again today. Just a note, I did add something else to the schedule today also. So at 4 p.m., we'll have Sierra Pascual Marquina from Venezuela Analysis come on to talk about the Venezuelan elections, the international, well, the US and European attempt to undermine them, and everything else that's going on, and we'll get some reports from on the ground there in Venezuela. So I'm looking forward to that. Also, very much looking forward to this conversation. So today we have Charlotte Cates from Samidoun. We possibly could have another person joining us from Samidoun, but they're currently not able to join right at this moment. Um, but we had a conversation with them back in probably November, certainly early on October, November. Um, about the struggle of Palestinian prisoners. That conversation, a lot of it kind of hinged around understanding the relationship between October 7th and Palestinian prisoners, right? Because that's been a central demand. It was part of the reason for the Operation Al Aqsa flood in the first place, right? So we kind of contextualized that, talked about the state of detention of Palestinians. And, there's a lot. Interestingly, I wanted to have this conversation with them also because they're a Palestinian organization that operates all around the world and has been repressed significantly, historically, but even more since October 7th. So we'll get into some of that as well. Um, but anyways, I had reached out to them because it had been a while and wanted to talk about prisoner issues. Obviously, now we are in Black August, which is also a month in the United States when we're thinking about the issues of political prisoners, prisoners in the United States and around the world, right? And so it's a good time to be having another discussion about this. And then Monday happened, and Sde Teiman, there's this wild story that I'm sure people followed of these mass it feels ridiculous to talk about it. I'm sure people have heard about it, but basically these mass pro-rape demonstrations and mobilizations that were going on throughout the Zionist entity, where people were literally invading their own military bases and camps in order to, um, in support of people who were accused of uh, torture, sexual violence, rape, right? And so, anyways, that is something that doesn't have a lot of precedence in human history. So that was a significant event. But actually, I just wanted to say that this conversation, we had scheduled it prior to that. So certainly it's timely because of all of that going on, and to be able to talk about, use that moment also to talk about Palestinian detention more broadly as a part of this war. But yeah, that wasn't actually the thing that led to this conversation. So obviously we'll talk about that. And then of course we can't have this conversation without talking about the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh just the other day too. So we'll be talking about that as well. So anyways, without saying more, I'll just welcome Charlotte back to the show. It's good to be with you again, Charlotte, and looking forward to this conversation, even though obviously we'll be talking about a lot of really heinous stuff, really. So
Yes, well, thank you so much for the invitation. And we in Samidoun, as a movement, as a network, are always, really honored to participate. The discussions that Millennials Are Killing Capitalism have been hosting about Palestine have been tremendous resources for the movement and have communicated really clear information and analysis that it's so important for people to have access to in order for our advocacy, our organizing, our solidarity work, our efforts to be as powerful and strong as they can be.
I appreciate that compliment, and just would say that Sami Dune is an organization that I likewise look um, to follow your analyses and your work and mobilizations. And so, anyways, I salute the work that you all do as an international organization advocating for Palestinian prisoners, and just as a important organization in the Palestinian, liberation movement more broadly. And so salute to you all for sure. So let's start, with the most recent, and kind of we can work our way back and talk also. We'll also the other thing is that there's the 300th day since this genocide commenced is coming up, and you all are calling for some mobilizations around that, and are not just you, but there's broad calls for mobilizations that you all are participating in and supporting the call for. Um, and so we'll talk about that a little bit today also. Um, but Ismail Hania was assassinated. Was it, I guess, 2 days ago now? Just this week has been one of the longest weeks, which in 10 months of very long weeks. Um, and, we wanted to talk a little bit with you about the connection between his assassination, the kind of history of assassinations as a key tactic in, kind of Zionists, counterinsurgency warfare, and how the Palestinian resistance, endures despite these tactics. And so, yeah, just take that wherever you want to go with it. I know there's a lot that we could say.
Absolutely. Well, the assassination of the martyr Ismail Haniyeh is part and parcel of the Zionist assassination policy that has been, frankly, a central pillar of the Zionist project since its establishment in 1948 and long before. We've seen time and time again that Palestinian leaders, organizers, writers, artists, poets, military leaders, political leaders, anyone who has stood out as someone who is a leader to the Palestinian people at some level has been, at least at the very least, at risk of assassination or imprisonment by the Zionist regime, and that's without exception. And so when we look at the history of Zionist assassinations, when we look at the recent, ones like Ismail Haniyeh and Saleh Arori, but going back to Abu Ali Mustafa, Fethi Shikaki, Ghassan Kanafani, Kamal Nasser, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, and Abdulaziz Rantisi, Abu Jihad, Muhammad al Najjar, Basil Kabaisi, Samir Kuntar, Tariq Izzeddin, Kamal Adwan, Sheikh Hadar Adnan, and Ibrahim al Rai within the prisons of the occupation. What we see is a parade of leaders, a parade of heroes to the Palestinian struggle, and really to the international social justice movement and the international revolutionary movement, of which the Palestinian cause has played a central role for over 76 years. This was the case when the Zionist colonization project in Palestine was still happening 1940, before 1948, and labor leaders in Haifa were being assassinated by Zionist forces. The policy of assassination has been one that has been, kind of a bulwark of the Zionist movement, something that they see as a mechanism to try to constantly behead the Palestinian liberation movement. But no matter how much they've seen that as a goal, it's also clear that it has completely failed to achieve its objectives. They have taken the lives in these criminal assassinations of great leaders, of great heroes, of people who have contributed so much to Palestine and contributed so much to the world and had so much more still to contribute. And so I don't mean to say that these assassinations are insubstantial, because there is something of great value that is taken every single time the Zionist project continues this policy. However, what they have not succeeded in doing on any of these occasions is weakening the capacity or the strength of the resistance, or instilling that deterrent effect that they seem to wish to do, which is to stop the Palestinian people from taking up the choice of resistance. Instead, it has only made the movement and the people stronger and more committed to the liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. It has only made it clear that there can be no compromise with the Zionist occupation regime, that it is an illegitimate colonial project planted in the heart of Palestine. Now, of course, speaking from the imperial core, it's also very important for us to recognize that these are not Zionist crimes alone. at the very least, we're talking about a Zionist slash US assassination policy, because it's very clear that as soon as Netanyahu returned from the United States, he embarked upon a new series of assassinations and attacks. Certainly, this assault on the sovereign territory of the Islamic Republic of Iran was is an assassination attack against a beloved and deeply respected Palestinian leader who really was distinguished in his high levels of commitment to Palestinian national unity. And so also was met in return with a great deal of popular love and enthusiasm. But this was also an attack on the sovereignty of the Islamic Republic of Iran. This was an attack upon the Iranian people. And this is one of the reasons why, in addition to the love and commitment for the Palestinian cause, that we saw this massive funeral march taking place in Tehran today for Ismail Haniyeh, together with his bodyguard, Wassim Abu Shaban, who was martyred with him at the same time. And of course, this wasn't the only assassination that took place on that day. This came hours after the Zionist regime bombarded the south of Lebanon, the southern suburbs of Beirut, Adahia, and killed people, destroyed a building, and also targeted Syed Mohsen Fuad Shukr, one of the leaders of Hezbollah, one of the very distinguished leaders of Hezbollah, who, for that matter, was also known, was also listed on the US's most wanted list for his role in resisting the presence of US Marines in Lebanon. And this is, this is also like the second assassination carried out by the Zionist regime in Lebanon, in which the target has also been on the US most wanted list. Before this, it was Saleh Aruri. And so I think it's really important for us to notice that and to recognize that these are Zionist US assassinations, and they are being supported by the entire imperialist camp. If we're looking at Britain, France, Germany, Canada, the entire imperialist camp is lining up to support these assassination policies, to say absolutely nothing about the blatant violations of any aspect of international law, of respect for international sovereignty, of a so-called rules-based international order. Well, it seems like one of the rules of the Western international order is that the Zionist regime and its imperialist sponsors and partners get to assassinate resistance leaders anywhere in the world. And so this wasn't, just a Zionist crime. And this wasn't just a US crime. It really reflected that alliance of Zionism and imperialism that is driving this genocide forward, that is continuing to arm and fund and propel it forward. But at the same time, I just think it's also important for us and for our collective movement to mourn and salute and honor these leaders who have been taken away, but also to take very seriously the messages that are coming from the resistance and from the whole camp of resistance in the region, and from every one of the organizations that has been targeted, and really from the Palestinian people as a whole, which is that this will not succeed in killing the resistance, that a response is coming that is going to be stronger than ever before, that as Khalil al-Hayya said today in the funeral in Tehran, that we will never recognize Israel, that the path of Oslo is dead and buried and gone. The so-called two-state solution is over and done with. And that's another thing that the Zionists have assassinated, or any illusions that might be remaining about the ability to market to Palestinians, colonialism, apartheid, and ongoing genocide, but quieter genocide as a solution to the Zionist crimes. There can be no more illusions about the nature of this project or about the ability to coexist with it, because it will always be a project of assassination, of execution, and of genocide. And these martyrs will serve as symbols. They will be the people that are honored in the textbooks and histories in schools and statues in the history of the people of the world. And that history is not something that will be soon forgotten. Instead, it's something that will enter a record of immortals. Truly, not only in kind of an emotional sense, but in the sense that these are people who have changed the world. And they have changed the world not, of course, as individuals, but acting together with their organizations, with their movements, with their people, and have truly opened the path and opened the door forward as leaders of those movements into an era in which it can be certain that Palestine will be free of Zionism and the region will be free of US imperialism. And so this does not show that the Zionist entity is stronger than it has ever been. In fact, these are the wild death throes of a wounded monster. And those wild death throes are damaging. Those wild death throes kill, and they murder and they massacre and they drop bombs and they take the lives of 40,000 Palestinians in Gaza. And they swipe at the most beloved leaders of the resistance and of the people. But it is still a dying monster. And it is still a paper tiger that is bound to fall sooner than anticipated.
That was wonderful. I just wanna say I just really appreciate the all of what you just said and the clarity, and yeah, that was that was great. Um, so I wanna move now to the other big event of the week, and you all wrote a piece about Sde Teiman as the true face of the Zionist project. Really, how we can look at this, wild news story, this spectacular kind of instance, and then extrapolate it out to understand truly what the life of Palestinians in detention is, what it means for these military camps, these concentration camps, to really understand the scale of the war that goes beyond also the horrific atrocities and bombings that we see in Gaza. Um, so yeah, could you say take that again wherever you would like to, but I appreciated the piece that you wrote. I should note that both the piece on Ismail Hania and the piece on Sde Teiman are linked in the show description along with links to your website, so people can check them out for themselves as well. But yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for raising this and for having this important discussion. And one of the things we're seeing right now with this policy of assassinations is kind of an attempt to wipe the pro-rape riots off of the pages of the media to kind of divert attention from the fact that the nature of the Zionist project was revealed so vividly and so disgustingly in front of the face of the world. And of course, we can say that this has been being revealed, if not for the past 76 years, then at the very least for the past 10 months of horrific bombing, of the images of hospitals being assaulted, of refugees in tents being bombed, of the attacks on children. We've seen beheaded children in Palestine in the past 10 months. They've been Palestinian children. And so there's also, so this isn't the only time, of course, by far, that we've seen the nature of the Zionist entity revealed, but it was something that was really quite striking because it also revealed the internal contradictions, the deep level of fascism in Zionist society, and the commitment of all levels of the state to fundamentally affirming time and time again that the right to rape and torture is a fundamental right of the Zionist project that shall not be infringed upon by anyone, not even Zionist military police, and not even after they were going to engage in one of the normal perfunctory so-called investigations that then succeed in releasing the person without charges days later, as we traditionally see in every such so-called investigation that is carried out by the Zionist regime. Now, of course, the Sde Teiman concentration camp has already there have been thousands of Palestinians who have been abducted from Gaza, who have been taken to this concentration camp. We do not know the full numbers of Palestinians that are being held there. One of the things that has become quite clear is that there has been a tremendous effort on the part of the Zionist project to obscure information about who is being held there, about the conditions under which they are being held, about the circumstances that they face, about their names, their identities. There are people who have been missing for 10 months and their families cannot get information about where they are and whether they're alive and whether they're still being detained here. We have seen doctors, I mean, doctors and healthcare workers have actually been particularly targeted for this kind of kidnapping. Every single time the Zionists assault a hospital, they kidnap the medical staff and they take them to concentration camps, much like this. We've seen beloved doctors like Dr. Adnan al-Bursh massacred, martyred inside these detention camps. We know that at least 38 and most likely more Palestinians have been killed inside the detention facilities due to extreme torture, abuse. We've seen people going into these camps with healthy arms and limbs, and they come back with amputations. People are suddenly kind of released and thrown back into Gaza. They're taken to the hospital. They have incredible testimonies to tell of their stories and experiences of what happened to them and what happened to the people around them. And the fact is that these crimes are so these testimonies are so compelling and so accurate and so undeniable that even CNN, the New York Times, and the Washington Post have been compelled to report about them. Now, these are the same publications that have, by and large, been pushing completely discredited narratives about the Palestinian resistance and have been kind of covering up Zionist crimes. There have been, even leakers who have exposed the nature of what is happening there. I mean, the details of there have been several reports of like what the case looked like that led to these 9 members of the Zionist military being arrested by military police. In all accounts, however, a Palestinian man was raped and or sexually assaulted by these 9 men so severely that he was taken to the hospital with severe damage and internal bleeding to his rectum and anus, and that this case was so extreme that it prompted the military police to arrest this person, which most likely means somewhere someone reported it. And the response of the Zionist establishment was to go into the streets, to actually attack their own so called beloved military, to invade military bases, and to go into the Knesset and speak very openly, declaring that yes, it is absolutely the right of Zionist interrogators to rape Palestinians if they're in the resistance. But really, it's not even conditioned on that fact. These images of Zionists rushing into the courts and to the military areas to demand the release of these people, um, Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. And I mean, these are ministers in the government. Itamar Ben-Gvir is the Minister of Internal Security. That means he's in charge of the Israel Prison Service. That means he's the person who's dictating the conditions of confinement that Palestinian prisoners and detainees are facing. And he's out there saying that this is, an unacceptable attack on our soldiers to not freely allow people to be raped. And of course, there's just so many severe crimes that are taking place. People are being subjected to electroshock torture. People are being strapped down to a bed 24/7 and hooded. People are being forcibly starved. One lawyer who went to the detention camp, the only lawyer who's been able to do so far, a Palestinian lawyer, Khalid Mahajna, he was able to see one journalist who works for Al Arabi TV, and probably if that were the case, he wouldn't have been able to see this person at all. When his client was brought out, he was emaciated and covered in bird droppings and dirt. And that's when they're bringing this person out to see a lawyer. So that really shows the level of conditions of life that people are experiencing inside this concentration camp. People are being beaten, people are being sexually assaulted, people are being abused. I mean, if we're going to, it's very reminiscent of the stories and experiences of people detained at Abu Ghraib. It's very reminiscent of the experiences of people detained at Guantanamo. And these are comparisons that Palestinians are using themselves to discuss what's taking place there. And also, these aren't very far apart from the conditions that Palestinians faced in 1947 to 1948 during Al Nakba, when they were held in labor camps and essentially used as forced enslaved labor in order to try to construct the Zionist project on the destroyed Palestinian villages during Al Nakba. So, this project of mass incarceration, torture, interrogation, and abuse is one that stretches between Zionism and imperialism. It's, for that matter, it's reminiscent of the way that French colonialists treated Algerian detainees, the use of, the term is often used like, rape as a weapon of war, and certainly it is used as a weapon of war, but it's also very specifically used as a weapon of colonialism, and that includes rape and sexual assault against men as well as against women. And specifically, this attack and sexual attack on Arab and Palestinian men has been strategized about and viewed as a tactic quite openly by both Zionist and U.S. Strategists and writers for the past decades, and seen as a mechanism that would be able to, essentially try to break people's will, try to break people down, try to destroy them. I mean, Zionist soldiers have essentially been given free rein to engage in a systemic campaign of torture, rape, and abuse against the Palestinian people. This is a genocide in which soldiers film themselves blowing up universities, destroying water wells, going into Palestinian families' homes and putting on women's lingerie, just gloating about the destruction they are leveling upon civilians. I mean, anyone who talks about whether or not there's an admission to the intent to genocide should just look at the content that Zionist soldiers post on TikTok. It's really quite apparent that, and given that there are absolutely zero reprimands for any of this, it's quite clear that this is a systemic policy. And in fact, the fact that they're allowed to post this content shows that the content itself is intended as a form of psychological warfare against the Palestinian people, to say like, oh yeah, we are committing genocide, we're proud of it, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it because look at the fact that we're posting this on social media quite openly. And every day, of course, we're seeing settler violence, attacks on Palestinian villages in the West Bank, kidnapping of Palestinians, invasions of Palestinian homes, time and time again. And it's also important to note, like, when these Zionists invaded military camps and bases, and they were treated with kid gloves. Like, yeah, it was like, oh, these are opposing sides and these are riots against the government for the right to rape. But no, it was treated as like a normal difference in society that should be respected. They were treated with kid gloves. If Palestinians actually went into a Zionist military base to attack it and to demand that the prisoners be freed and liberated, they would be shot dead. They would be massacred. And it would be held up before the eyes of the world as a so-called terrorist attack. And when these Zionists engaged in their kind of right to rape riots, those were treated as a respectable and important part of society that needs to be coddled, and in fact gets an apology and is told that, yes, you know what, it was handled the wrong way. We should not have arrested the rapists for raping them. That was too confrontational. And so this is why it can't be said in any way that, Sde Teiman is just like an outrage or a few bad apples. What Zionism means, what Zionism is hordes of fascists screaming for their right to rape and abuse and torture Palestinians. Many times when we talk about Palestine, we talk about, or Palestinian sources and writers talk about the rape of the land. And that is a metaphor, but it's not just a metaphor. The fact is that Zionists have used rape and sexual assault against the Palestinian people as a mechanism of torture and as a mechanism of abuse for 76 years. And many times this is left unspoken or covered up or certainly silenced in international media. At the same time that all of these international media sources have seen fit to publish repeatedly either debunked or entirely unproven allegations against the Palestinian resistance, referring to the heroic military operation of October 7th directed at the liberation of Palestinian prisoners and at a serious military confrontation with the Gaza brigades as a site of mass rape or sexual violence or sexual assault, despite the fact that every single independent investigation, as much as there has been any allowed, because the Zionist regime steadfastly refuses to allow any independent external investigation into Al Aqsa flood and the events of October 7th, have found absolutely no evidence for this claim whatsoever. There isn't one person speaking about this. And at the same time, there are dozens of Palestinians speaking directly about their own experiences of sexual assault and violence and torture at the hands of the occupation. And those are completely invisibilized. They are made irrelevant while debunked stories that are being perpetrated by members of Zaka, a far-right Zionist organization that also perpetrated the fake stories about beheaded babies, about babies in ovens. All of these stories are fake, and they are part and parcel of the same far-right Zionist milieu that is currently engaging in the right-to-rape protests. And that's the source of the so-called allegations of sexual assault on the 7th of October and during Al-Aqsa flood. So it's very important for us to be clear that this is not an aberration in Zionism. The Zionist policy is that it is right to torture and rape and abuse Palestinians and the land of Palestine, and that is not unusual. It is absolutely abhorrent. It is disgusting, but it is the nature of colonialism and imperialism, and that's why it looks like Guantanamo, and that's why it looks like Abu Ghraib, and that's why it looks like the French in Algeria. And so, if we are going to take seriously the fight against colonialism, it is absolutely essential that we do both of these things. One is to expose, to amplify the stories of Palestinian detainees, to call for their liberation, to recognize that while this is a military concentration camp, its conditions are not too far removed from the everyday experiences of Palestinians under interrogation and from the everyday experiences of starvation, torture, and abuse inside the regular occupation prisons. It is not far removed from that, and that this is not a response to or revenge for the 7th of October by the Zionist forces. These are the conditions that are one of the reasons why the Palestinian resistance was willing to take the risk and take such immense sacrifices and pay such a heavy price in order to achieve the liberation of Palestinian prisoners. Because this is the experience of Palestinian prisoners. Rasmia Oda was deported from the United States in large part because she had played a role in exposing, a significant role in exposing the systemic use of sexual violence against female Palestinian prisoners in the late 1970s, before the United Nations, in the London Times. And that experience was then brought back by the US government 30 years later to say that she's a danger, to say that she's a threat, and to say that she should be deported. So this is nothing new, but it's also very important for us to reject in all forms these false allegations and propaganda against the resistance, to demand testimony, to demand proof, to not allow the Zionist regime to set the standards of discourse and to say that, oh, certainly it's, something might have happened, or, we're not devaluing these experiences. These aren't experiences. These are narratives being promoted by the far-right Zionist project as part of their fascist campaign in order to dehumanize Palestinians. They existed before the 7th of October. They exist after the 7th of October. The only thing that has changed is that the genocide is full-scale and obvious to everyone around the world, with their assassination of tens of thousands of Palestinians, and that the Palestinian resistance is stronger than it ever has been before and closer to the liberation of Palestine, despite the horrors, despite the abuses, despite the torture. It is true that we are closer today to the liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea than we have ever been before in the past 76 years.
Much appreciated for that breakdown. Folks in the audience too, if you do have questions for Charlotte, feel free to drop those in the chat. Hang on, I'm just gonna. All right, there we go. Um, I kind of wanted to offer or ask a kind of follow up to that too, because I think that um, well, gosh, I have 2 follow-ups, but maybe I can ask them together and you can decide what you wanna respond to. But I think, one would be, well, just kind of what you said, right? Which is that the response, those events happened, or the pro-rape riots happen on Monday, right? And then on Tuesday, we get this assassination campaign across, and as you said, like this obviously takes something out of the news cycle, which Israel very much lost her. Hopefully she comes back there in a second. Um, as she's trying to log back in, I'll just say thanks everybody for being here. Make sure to do the basic things and like the video, subscribe, share it with your comrades and friends and stuff like that so that we can get this information out to more people. Um, Glad you're back. So just was gonna say that the yeah, so this happens, you get the pro rape riots one day, you get the assassination campaign, the following day. And, there's definitely I think a one way to look at this is to say, there's the news cycle aspect of it, of getting it out of the news cycle, getting people talking to something else. But there's also this, you know, definite escalation, right, in crossing multiple, I mean, Israel, Zionist entity has been crossing red lines for 76 years, and certainly many of them that we've seen over the last 10 months, but also taking actions that they know warrant responses and escalations from, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Iran, whether it's Hamas, whether, obviously Ansar Allah still has a response, that they're going to have for being bombed at, their oil fields last week, and so you see this sort of move to widen the conflict, to push the support fronts into direct fronts really against the Zionist entity, that it is Israel that is kind of, trying to egg this on, right? And, we could read this as saying they can't deal with their own internal contradictions at this time. And so they want to, that they believe that a wider war is kind of a only way that they can possibly, preserve themselves. You could read it as trying to create a situation where the US and maybe other Western powers become more directly involved because their interests in it become even greater. Um, and so, yeah, I'm interested in kind of how you're thinking about that.
I mean, it's certainly true. It's certainly true that it's quite clear that the Zionist regime wants to see even greater involvement from the U.S. I mean, the U.S. has already provided billions of dollars in weaponry. I mean, to the extent that there's really no choice or option but to call this a U.S. Zionist genocide. There's been this pretext of creating, things like the humanitarian aid pier, which was then used as the basis for a military assault and another massacre against the Palestinian people in Nusayrat camp, and the rest of the pier floated away. So, this kind of exposed this whole narrative about them being concerned about humanitarian aid. I mean, the fact is that Rafah crossing has been blocked for the past 10 months. All of these discussions of novel ways of introducing aid and food into Gaza, or that Gaza has a humanitarian problem, are completely ludicrous and bogus to an extent as to be laughable, if there's anything laughable in the middle of this genocide. Because the fact is that there have been thousands upon thousands of trucks lined up in Egypt, simply waiting for the opportunity to cross there. And the fact is that Palestinians in Gaza had developed, despite the conditions of being under siege, despite the conditions of being under continued occupation, especially of the sea and of the skies. The fact is that Palestinians had essentially liberated the land of Gaza and under the land of Gaza in order to build the resistance tunnels and to build these networks of struggle. And so that meant, in many ways, defending Palestinian farmers to be able to farm their land, defending Palestinian fishers. Many of the attacks and the siege on Gaza that we've seen have been essentially attempts to prevent Gaza, and just like every other part of Palestine, from establishing kind of food sovereignty and its ability to sustain itself. But Palestinians in Gaza did not have a problem with access to food. They have a problem with colonialism. They have a problem with occupation. They have a problem with genocide. And so, right now, essentially, especially after this was launched, right after, immediately upon Netanyahu's return from the United States, and nobody can possibly believe than what was quite certainly an Israeli interceptor Iron Dome missile falling in Majd al-Shams was the pretext for all of this. Well, it was a pretext, but it certainly wasn't the reason, because the Zionist regime has been seeking. On the one hand, they are seeking a regional war, especially with Iran. They're demanding the US start a serious war with Iran. And this has been, obvious time and time again. And there are certain kind of contradictions within the halls of imperialism, not about whether it's worth confronting the resistant states and projects in the region, but about what the most strategic way is to confront those resistance projects in order to achieve their goals. Because the fact is also that this is no longer the world that it was 20 years ago, that there really is a multipolar world that is there, and that what we are seeing on the part of China, on the part of Russia, is an unwillingness to allow the ongoing just kind of extreme imperialist attacks of the United States to continue against the people of the world. We've seen, just weeks ago, China was hosting the leaders of the Palestinian resistance factions in Beijing, including, at the same time that essentially the US was preparing to host Benjamin Netanyahu. And while the agreement between the factions themselves might have really just kind of mirrored many other such agreements in the past 20 years, that event was still significant, but it was significant on the geopolitical level because it showed that, number one, that China was actually objecting to and refusing the US's attempt to impose a day after in Gaza with an international kind of basis of ruling, or that would exclude the Palestinian resistance factions. And so it was a clear rejection of that strategy at the international level. It was also a clear rejection of the attempt to marginalize and label as terrorists before the world the Palestinian resistance factions. Instead, these were important members of a diplomatic delegation that has important things to say about Palestine. And so, to the extent that this event showed that China was actually stepping forward in Palestine as a counterbalance to the United States, a counterbalance that has been severely absent for the past 30 years, over 30 years. This was an important step forward, and this was a historic occasion. And so, this is also a consideration in the minds of the US ruling class when there is a debate about whether it is worthwhile to start an immediate war with Iran. And this is the same contradiction that we see among certain levels of the Zionist society as well, because the issue isn't whether they want to destroy the resistance, or whether they want to dominate the region, or whether they want to have complete hegemonic domination of the region, its resources, and its economy, especially hand in hand with US-led imperialism. The question is only what's the most effective method to achieve that goal. And for some imperialists and Zionists, the most effective method to achieve that goal is the all-out genocide and immediate attack at attempting to get the United States to bomb Iran. And for others, the most effective method that they see is kind of a slower policy of attrition, but that they believe can preserve the lifespan of the Zionist entity. And so what we see is, for the long term, because to you can engage in these kinds of genocides and these kind of all-out attacks and these assassination campaigns, but they don't make the entity itself a more stable long-term project in the region. In fact, they only hasten its demise because they escalate the resistance and they escalate the rejection of the entity. And it makes it clear that this is an enemy project that will never have a base in the region, that will never be a legitimate part of the region. It will only be there through force and colonialism. You have to constantly maintain that force in order to keep the entity there. So those who are concerned for the long-term future of the entity, view these kinds of actions as adventurous. And then this is what we see from the United States as well. I mean, this is a US colonial project in the region. This is the greatest aircraft carrier that we could have. This is, as Joe Biden said, if Israel wasn't there, we'd have to create it. This is the US project in the region. And so they are very concerned with how best to maintain their control. But what doesn't change between these forces that are having the debate is their interest in maintaining that control. And so, for example, when we look at the US elections and we look at Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, well, they might express things differently, but the policy is the same. The fundamentals are the same. And those fundamentals are the denial of sovereignty and self determination to every people and country in the Arab and Iranian region. This is it remains the unequivocal support of the Zionist project and the arming of it with billions upon billions of dollars every single year, the declaration of Palestinian resistance organizations leading an absolutely legitimate anti-colonial struggle. I mean, legitimate under international law, under UN resolutions, just as much as it's legitimate in kind of a human and obvious and natural sense. The labeling of these organizations as so-called terrorist organizations, the criminalization of any engagement or support with them, at least at a material level, the repression of demonstrators. I mean, we saw absolute unity between Republicans and Democrats in condemning people for coming to march in Washington against the presence of this war criminal, Benjamin Netanyahu. And this comes along regardless of whether they think Netanyahu's tactics are the best tactics to preserve the Zionist entity moving forward. Because I think for some in the US and in the Zionist security establishment, it's become quite clear that Netanyahu also has a personal interest, essentially, in maintaining his political position and not going to jail and not being prosecuted on past corruption charges, on not being held accountable for the severe failures of the Zionist intelligence and military, for their ability to, murder thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Palestinians and not really do much to hinder the capacities of the resistance in Gaza. He has a personal interest in kind of keeping the war going as much as possible. But the question is that going to help the entity stay in its place for longer? And that's why you see some forms of objection and some forms of consideration. And the fact is that, Iran is a strong nation. Yes, the Zionists were able to sabotage something and carry out an assassination. They were able to do that. That is true. But the fact is that Iran is a strong nation with a strong military and a strong base of power. And that is not something that for even the United States can take lightly. The fact in the south of Lebanon and throughout Lebanon that this is a resistance movement that liberated the south of Lebanon from the Zionists before in 2000, that liberation in May 2000 was actually one of the main transformative points that changed the entire situation throughout the Arab world and throughout the region from this path of Oslo, which while while completely unable to address Palestinians' needs, was still progressing. I mean, the Al-Aqsa Intifada broke out in Palestine 5 months after the south of Lebanon was liberated. In many ways, the victories of Hezbollah set this entire process into motion. I mean, we were speaking before about Ismail Haniyeh. He was among 415 members of Hamas and Islamic Jihad that were exiled for 1 year to Marj al-Zuhur in southern Lebanon. And this was meant to show the power of the Zionist regime to expel these forces from Palestine. These were all Palestinians that were born in Palestine. But what it also did was it enabled Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah to communicate together and to develop their networks of communications, particularly at a time. This was in person, without any kind of electronic communications, without any kind of insecure communications, that developed the basis for this alliance of resistance that we see today. It was Hezbollah liberating the south of Lebanon that in many ways led directly to the eruption of the Al-Aqsa Intifada in September 2000, alongside, yes, the devastation and destruction that Oslo caused to the Palestinian people and the ongoing crimes of the Zionist regime, that there was an example just to the north of people liberating their land through resistance. Um, that Hezbollah got rid of the Zionists in 2006 as well. This is a serious, disciplined, large military organization that is more than capable not only of defending the land and people of Lebanon, but of entering Palestine and liberating part of the north of Palestine. I mean, they've already emptied the north of Palestine of soldiers and settlers, which is in and of itself is yet another contradiction within the Zionist project as they argue about whether or not it was, as they argue and debate about whether or not it was okay for the settlers and soldiers to be evacuated and rehomed, as well as, arguments about how whether Zionists in Tel Aviv, for example, are prioritized above the settlers in the north and the south of occupied Palestine. These are serious military opponents. We've seen, for example, Yemen coming out of years upon years upon years of over a decade of sanctions, of siege, of attempts to, fundamentally destroy the Yemeni people and their project by the U.S. through its proxies, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And the fact is that the Yemeni military was able to send a drone to the middle of Tel Aviv and kill a settler. So this is the Yemeni military is also a strong force. It has shut down the supply lines of genocide. The port of Eilat was closed due to bankruptcy. Um, this is what has been achieved by the Yemeni people, government, armed forces, and the Ansar Allah movement. So when we talk about and for that matter, we talk about the Iraqi resistance. I mean, these are the resistance forces that that got the US by and large out of Iraq, although they're still maintaining footholds. But they successfully waged a struggle against the US occupiers for years and forced them out of Iraq. So when we talk about Iran and Hezbollah and Iraq and Yemen and for that matter, Syria, who has survived a proxy war also for the past 10 years. These are serious opponents that the Zionist entity cannot kind of take lightly. And these are also people and nations that have obtained their sovereignty on their land and are able to develop their military capacities openly, whereas the resistance in Palestine has been developing its military capacities very strongly, but has had to do so in many ways kind of undercover. So when we talk about what a regional war means, it's clear that Netanyahu wants more war, more destruction, the US to bomb Iran. This is very clear. But what is not included in this calculation for the Zionists that are pushing that forward is that the resistance forces of the region are not the same as they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or 30 years ago. We are talking about strong, powerful resistance forces that are capable of bringing the Zionist entity down once and for all. And have already have the justification for doing so after the repeated bombings, assassinations, violations of sovereignty, and attacks. I mean, The assassination of Ismail Haniyeh follows upon the assassination of Iranian nuclear scientist after nuclear scientist. This is an attempt to essentially, conduct the same kind of scholasticide against Iran that they are doing in Gaza. Uh, every week, there's a report of the Zionist military bombing Damascus and maybe killing several or one Syrian at a time. They have repeatedly engaged in attacks and invasions of South Lebanon. For that matter, they're still occupying Lebanese land in the Sheba Farms and Kfar Shuba. This ongoing, I mean, the US, just the same day that the Zionists were attacking southern Lebanon and assassinating Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, the US was bombing the Iraqi resistance. So the fact is that these are serious forces with serious power that are capable of bringing the Zionist regime down. And so the calculations that they make about a regional war, they must be very aware, have the tremendous potential to backfire on them in a very significant way. And so the discussion about what a regional war means, the fact is that the resistance forces do care very deeply for their people. They care for their land. They care for the future. They care for the lives that people have. They care for their people's ability to study, to develop their economies, to grow, to protect themselves, to love one another. These are forces that are in many ways on the front lines of defending humanity. These are forces that hold themselves back because of their commitment to their people and to a better future for the region, for the world, and for their countries. And so, what a future regional war can mean for Zionism is really nothing but its defeat.
I appreciate all of that, and I think we've seen that. Anybody who's followed closely too, like there are many times when the resistance forces could have, you know, responded much more forcefully, and they've always been very measured and calculated in terms of how they respond. And in part, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that the basis of that is also this deep commitment to humanity too, and not, you know, we haven't seen resistance forces in the region attacking civilians. It's not, and so yeah, I mean, it's been military targets, it's been careful, ladder of escalation in terms of increasing and responding to, what the Zionist entity has done, to them and to the Palestinians, and so yeah, I mean, I don't think that, yeah, I agree with your point too about this question within the US in terms of it's not a question of whether there's anybody who really wants to reign in, the Zionist entity in. It's really a question of how of differences in opinions on what the most effective way to support, and what the war should look like from a kind of policy standpoint from the US. And I think that can connect into the next conversation question I wanted to bring in, which is sort of, August 3rd. I want you to talk about what's going on August 3rd, and talk about other things that you're thinking about in terms of the solidarity movement, you know, the portion of the Palestinian movement that's in the United States and Canada and in the West. Um, and the other thing that I would say too is like we're getting to a point, and obviously we don't want this, genocide to drag on, another day at this point. But we're getting into August now. It means that students will be back on campus soon. There'll be, perhaps more organizing, more protests, more mobilizations, people thinking and strategizing again about what they can do, in different ways. And I'm one of the things that I've been concerned about is people um drifting into the kind of electoral politics that, the replacement of Genocide Joe with Kamala Harris is a younger face, a woman of color, right? And someone who can maybe seeks to appeal more to younger constituencies to make herself seem the more reasonable, rational, relatable kind of candidate that Joe Biden, frankly, was not capable of presenting himself as anymore. And that this is the history that we've seen of the Democratic Party of trying to, co-opt, undermine movements and bring any movement energy that's going on in the world and say this is the place where it can, where it can reside, where we can pragmatically deal with these concerns, where we can go for a ceasefire, right? And so I just want, yeah, just give you space to that. One, to talk about August 3rd, but also to talk about these considerations around where people are investing their energy right now in the United States, but also other places in the West in terms of, organizing around Palestinian solidarity.
Absolutely, and these are really important questions. I'm going to speak a little bit about August 3rd first, and then speak about the current situation of electoral politics in the imperial core and what they mean. And these are also questions that are relevant, in Canada, in Britain, in the Netherlands, in Belgium. These aren't, questions that, in France. These aren't questions that just exist in the U.S., but they exist in a lot of places, even if the form that they take is a little bit different in some of the other imperialist states. So August 3rd is a date that has been called for by prisoners organizations, by a kind of a wide variety of organizations throughout Palestine to make this an international day of action for Gaza and for the prisoners, because it's around the 300th day of the genocide, and because of the importance of focusing on these two particular points of confrontation in and against the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Now, one of the things that I think is very important for us in the solidarity movement to note and to move forward with is that, the last public statement that uh, Ismail Haniyeh made before he was martyred was to urge for mass popular mobilization everywhere to participate in the August 3rd call for Gaza the prisoners. He said, "Freedom is near for our dignified prisoners, and victory is coming for our people and our valiant resistance. We call for active, massive participation on this national and global day of defense of prisoners and our people in the Gaza Strip to expose the brutal crimes of the occupation against them and to support their rights and just cause. We look forward to making the 3rd of August a pivotal day in all parts of Palestine, in the refugee camps and in the diaspora, in our Arab and Islamic world, and among all of the free people of the world to support our people in Gaza and our free prisoners in the occupation prisons." And so, given the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh and what the Zionists seek to achieve through their assassination policy, not only in this instance, but in the consistent use of assassinations throughout over 76 years of Zionist colonialism, that it is an important rebuke to the policy of assassination, as well as an important mechanism of solidarity and support for the prisoners, and to bring the assault on Gaza to an end for us to get out and organize on the 3rd of August in our cities, in our communities, wherever we are. Now, of course, in October, November, and December of 2023, we saw the largest mass mobilizations that took place. And then again in April and May, we saw the student intifada and the student uprising. And these have been the two kind of largest in terms of numbers, points of mobilization in the solidarity movement, in the, especially in the heart of the imperial core, for Palestine. And this has been a very large, very dynamic, very diverse and growing movement that has really, I think, in many cases, been also a very critical vehicle for anti imperialist political education. That many people have come into this movement simply appalled and horrified by the images of genocide that they see playing out in front of them. And then they see US politician after US politician not only justifying the genocide, but vilifying those who speak out against it, attempting to criminalize them. We've seen thousands upon thousands of people arrested for participating in student led protests. And taking a look at what the nature of the system that is causing this to continue to happen, to continue to take place. And I know that, there's been, I think, in a lot of ways, sometimes people have a level of fatigue or disillusionment in the capacity of mass action. And in a lot of ways, that makes sense because, like, let's be clear, our marches and demonstrations are not going to be the action that liberates Palestine. The work that is really being done in that regard is being led by the resistance forces that are every single day, despite the assassinations, despite the genocide, are destroying tanks of the occupiers, are releasing videos that have been so moving and heroic that the red triangle has become a symbol everywhere in the world of a fight against injustice and colonialism. That it's a, you know, kind of the great symbol of rebellion of our era has become the red triangle. And so obviously, we know that taking the streets and doing mass demonstrations is just one part of doing popular mobilization for Palestine. So why do we still do it? Why does it still matter? Why do we need to come out on August 3rd? Well, in the first place, because the resistance forces are asking us to do that. And so, Ismail Haniya's last message to the people of the world was to go out on August 3rd and mobilize. Now, that mobilization can take various forms because as much as it's important for us to mobilize and engage in mass action, because mass action is how people get involved, it's how people come to their first actions for Palestine, it's how people find a political organization, it's how people start getting active, it's how people express community with one another, not just online, which is so important, but like in the streets, in a human, in a person-to-person way, and connect directly with the resistance. It's about building that culture of the popular cradle of the resistance that we see as so essential to the strength and power of the resistance in Palestine or in the south of Lebanon, and talking about what it actually means to build an international popular cradle of the resistance. An international popular cradle that nourishes and nurtures and develops stronger and more militant and more powerful resistance that is capable of significantly striking and rejecting the Zionist entity in all of its forms. And so, when we look at why do we need to mass mobilize, we don't need to mass mobilize because we think that if we go out and do a protest in the streets, that this is what's going to make Palestine liberated. We need to continue to do mass mobilization because we need an international popular cradle of the resistance. And part of it being a popular cradle is that there are ways that everybody can participate in resisting. But at the same time, one of, I think, the mistakes that often gets made in these discussions is that doing mass popular mobilization is kind of counterposed against escalation, as if these two things are a contradiction. And so, there's either mass mobilization or there's direct action. No, direct action and escalatory action, like when we look at what Palestine Action in Britain is doing to shut down arms factories, this action is directly bringing this is shut down two Elbit facilities once and for all. I mean, Elbit systems, obviously, as revolutionaries, we're not necessarily going to hold out that this company is particularly evil. It's, it's part and parcel of the capitalist system. It's part and parcel of imperialism. But if you were going to look at evil companies, Elbit Systems would certainly be like right up there at the top of it. They manufacture 85% of the Zionist armed drones that they're using to carry out these assaults and assassinations and genocide in Gaza. And when we hear about drone assassinations and strikes against refugee camps and central cities in the West Bank, those are being carried out by Elbit drones on a daily basis. So shutting those down by people taking action, by people, going in, literally breaking up computers, tearing apart arms factories, causing literal millions in pounds in physical damage to the arms factories. When people bring that not just to Britain, but to the United States, we've seen people forming Palestine Action chapters in the US. This is extremely important. This is also part of developing the resistance, and the popular cradle of the resistance here is escalating our actions, taking them a step up, making it clear that we are not just going to kind of settle for simple symbolic objections to genocide, but that we are going to make those objections as material as it is possible to do, to provide the kind of support that the Palestinian people and their resistance need and want and deserve. And so, you know, when we talk about August 3rd and this call for Gaza and the prisoners, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, if people are engaging with this, they already know why this matters. They've seen the genocide. People seen the genocide. People have seen the situation. People know why it matters to come out. People are organizing and mobilizing in their communities. But it's completely understandable why, kind of at a mass level, maybe people don't come out quite as much, or they feel kind of hopeless. This is a chance for us to take inspiration from the words of the martyrs, from the words of the leaders that the occupation and the colonizer want to take away from our international movement, and come back to the streets larger and stronger than we've been, to show that we will be as persistent and continuous as the resistances in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Yemen. Every single week, millions of people on Friday fill the streets of Sana'a in Yemen. And they've had millions of people filling the streets in Sana'a and Yemen, and they are shutting down the Red Sea, and they are engaging in strategic, targeted military campaigns against the Zionist project. And this is an example that can and should and must inspire everybody around the world, and must be a challenge to those of us in the imperial core to raise up our level of confrontation, mobilization, and organizing at all levels through escalation and through mass organizing in order to confront the Zionist project, and of course, to confront the imperialist project that is part and parcel of this genocide, that is right in our communities and in our cities and in our neighborhoods, and it is the nature of the states that we're living in. So when we speak about that, of course, there's kind of a direct line to thinking about the electoral projects. And so, when we're talking about the attack, these kind of U.S. elections, and the ability of the Democratic Party to co-opt movements, to take people's energy and shove it toward election campaigning. I mean, I have to say, I think they're going to be far less successful this time around than they have been in the past. There's been a great deal of kind of resilience built up in the movement, including in people that have just gotten involved in the past 9 or 10 months, to rejecting these kind of, in many ways, often very transparent attempts by the Democratic Party to redirect the attention of a movement that is fighting imperialism, Zionism, and genocide, and instead turning it into voting for a candidate who has consistently supported imperialism, Zionism, and genocide. I mean, which is no surprise, because this isn't like a moral test for an individual Democratic or Republican Party candidate. If you are a Democratic or Republican Party candidate and you're running for president or vice president, you are absolutely serving the interests of the US ruling class. And the interest of the US ruling class is domination, hegemony, and extraction of the wealth, labor, and resources of the people of the world. There is no other purpose of that. And part and parcel of that is the maintenance of the Zionist project, which has been a genocidal project since day one. So you're never going to find an alternative to genocide by voting for one of the parties of genocide. Even if Kamala Harris appears to be like nicer to listen to than Donald Trump, and so or more pleasant to look upon than Donald Trump. That isn't going to change the nature of the imperialist project. This is going to change the nature of the Zionist regime. In many ways, we're just having the debate about, whether we should be talking about Benjamin Netanyahu or Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid. These are really just different faces of the same colonialist project. There's never going to be a future in voting for the Democratic or Republican parties that has anything to do with ending imperialism in the region, or that has anything to do with bringing an end to Zionist genocide in occupied Palestine. And it is very important for us to cast aside any illusions that we might have about this. I mean, if we look at 2020 and the tremendous uprisings, the sort of the George Floyd uprising era, and how so much of that tremendous mass-based energy and support was then directed into voting out Donald Trump, which in effect meant voting for the Democratic Party. Um, that was a way of really diffusing a revolutionary moment in the heart of the imperial core. If we look back at 2004, let's go back 20 years, and the intense anti-war movement that was organizing and bringing out major, massive demonstrations, but also people engaging in intense, disruptive, direct actions across the country. And the way in which the John Kerry campaign, I mean, someone who was barely against the war to begin with. So much of the energy and the mass strength of the anti war movement didn't go into transforming that into an anti imperialist movement. Instead, went into voting for John Kerry. And that was the period of really the decline and fall of the anti Iraq war movement in the United States. And many of the people who are in this movement now have had those experiences in 2020 or in 2004 or in other eras. I mean, of course, we can speak about the Obama campaign and its ability to do so through communications, but the difference is that like in 2008, it more co-opted the potential of building any kind of a revolutionary movement against the ruling class after what had become apparent through the financial crisis, rather than co-opting an existing mass movement that was out there, as we saw very obviously in 2004 and 2020. Now, one of the things here is that most of the Democratic Party won't even really pay lip service to the cause, and that's a little bit of a different thing that we're seeing right now. After the protest against Netanyahu on July 24th in Washington, D.C., Kamala Harris came out and released a statement, condemning protesters for burning the U.S. flag or for burning an effigy of Benjamin Netanyahu. So they're not even willing to pay lip service or to say, to kind of engage in these, mealy-mouthed campaign speak about like how, oh, we understand that people are going through so much pain, but this isn't acceptable. They can barely even bring themselves to acknowledge Palestinian suffering and death. If you want to look at kind of what U.S. imperialism looks like, watch one of Matt Miller's press conferences at the U.S. State Department. There's just a complete lack of even like basic human engagement with the crimes of the Zionist regime that are being carried out in full view of the people of the world. There's a lack of even that basic human level of interaction or understanding. And so given that situation, how could, there's never going to be a future there's never going to be a future for liberation for Palestine within the bounds of US imperialism. I mean, there may be a time when the crisis becomes so great that US imperialism is forced to give up its Zionist colonial project in order to preserve the larger US imperialist project. But that's not going to be the commitment of any imperialist forces in the United States to a free Palestine. That's going to be about how to preserve US imperialism more broadly in the region and in the world. But right now, the Zionist project is the main weapon that US imperialism has. It is precious to them. It is precious to the entire system and to the ruling class for that reason. And so there's nothing for this movement to do except to reject all illusions in that system, to reject that system, and instead organize our people, build revolutionary movements, build political organizations. And, it's also important, it's important for us to take material action. It's also important for us to be clear with our rhetoric, with our politics, with our discussion. Let us let us have a fraction of the courage expressed by the resistance themselves and stand openly with the Palestinian resistance, with the Lebanese resistance, with the Yemeni resistance, with all of the forces of resistance in the region. These are the forces that are defending humanity. We should be proud to speak about Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and Hezbollah and Ansarullah. We should be proud to speak about these organizations. These are the organizations and movements. I mean, these are movements of the Palestinian people, the Iraqi people, the Lebanese people, the Yemeni people. These are the movements of the people of Iran. For example, when we saw these flood of people thronging the streets in Tehran today in the funeral of Ismail Haniyeh, this is a movement of the people, not just of a state. We should not be We should not shy away from speaking about the resistance. And I know that it can be frightening. It can be frightening and scary, especially for people, for example, for Arabs in the United States who have grown up with constant, essentially psychological warfare of Guantanamo, of Abu Ghraib, of the NYPD infiltrating community centers and organizations and engaging in demographic units, of looking at the example of people like the Holy Land Foundation Five, of people like Hassan al-Ashi and Shukri Abu Bakr. And, on July 27th, we just passed the 20th anniversary of the charges against them. And Mufid Abdul Qadir and Shukri Abu Bakr and Hassan al-Ashi are still in prison. And Shukri and Hassan are serving 65-year sentences for running the largest Muslim charity in the United States and for sending money to Palestine. And they very clearly just sent money to charitable organizations, and they were still accused of providing material support to Hamas. So it's completely understandable why people who have grown up in this environment are afraid. But that's why we need to do this collectively, so that it's not upon any individual or person, but it's upon us as a collective movement to, yeah, we're not saying we should violate the laws on material support, but there's a reason why the law is material support and not moral support and not political support, to at least to use our freedom of expression, to use our freedom of association, to speak openly about the resistance, about the resistance organizations, about those who are actually fighting and dying and paying the price for the liberation of Palestine on a daily basis. Because if we can't speak about the resistance, how can we build popular support for the resistance? And sometimes it's frightening to do it out loud, but yet there's a reason why the red triangle symbol is so resonant for people. And it's so resonant because the red triangle symbol, the existence of the resistance, shows that it is in fact possible to strike down this empire, that it is possible for this empire to fall. Because every single day, on a daily basis, fighters in Gaza and in the south of Lebanon and in Yemen are bringing this empire down piece by piece. And that, despite their technology, despite big tech, despite the weapons industry, despite the power of the US ruling class, despite the threat of US imperialism, despite the criminalization, despite the sanctions, despite the campaigns that have been designed to destroy people and nations, despite the confiscation of wealth and resources and labor for decades upon decades and centuries upon centuries of colonialism and then imperialism, that it is possible to bring down this empire, that it is possible for people to organize themselves, to develop their capacities, and to build a resistance movement that can empty Palestine of Zionism and empty the region of imperialism. And so let's look to the example of the resistance and not look for half measures, and not look to the Democratic Party, not look to the party of Genocide Joe to save us from genocide. The force that's going to save us from genocide are the axis of resistance, the camp of resistance. It's also important to say the broader camp of resistance in the world. That's why right now we're looking at attempts to undermine the election process in Venezuela. That's why every time that we post about it on Twitter, we have comrades who are in Venezuela right now and who are part of the electoral solidarity international delegations, that this is very much viewed as a blow to empire. And so they want to foment a fascist coup in Venezuela. Well, that's because, as Nicolas Maduro himself said in a trip to Iran in 2022, this is a broad camp of resistance. And so the question, it stretches not just in the region, but it also stretches, to the alliance of Sahel states. It stretches to to Cuba and to Venezuela and to Bolivia and to all of those that are resisting U.S. domination and control. It stretches, to Korea. It stretches to this entire international movement. And so the question, I think, for those of us in the imperial core, and the question that we need to answer for all of us in our organizations and our movements, is how are we going to be part of this global camp of resistance? And so on August 3rd, let's take a stand and let's do at least the small things that we can, the things that were being asked for by the resistance themselves, to be part of that global camp of the resistance and to be a worthwhile partner in this movement for liberation.
That was great. Again, everybody's really appreciating your commentary today, Charlotte. I feel like it's a combination of like the therapy and the church that we need right now, in this moment. So I thank you for all of your words. Um, I do have a couple questions from the audience, but yeah, there's a couple other things that that I did have. Hang on. I'm gonna mute you for just a sec because I'm getting an echo. Um, that I did have one was just if there were any other any other report outs or like updates that you wanted to share from the prisoner movement, since I know that's something that your organization focuses on. And the other was just to and we can ask this next, but I know that you all have faced significant repression as an organization, a lot of attempts to deplatform, to decriminalize, to criminalize your organization and so on. And I didn't want to know if you wanted to share any of that in terms of ways that people can be supportive of you all, but also maybe just illustrations of uh, your all commitment to continuing to do this work also despite facing the kind of repression and really like threats and things like that that you all have faced as well. But yeah.
Well, in terms of, thank you so much. And in terms of the struggle of the prisoners movement, I mean, every day this is a struggle that's continuing, right? Every day there are night raids that are taking place throughout occupied Palestine in which dozens of people are stolen from their homes, have their doors blown off their homes with explosives in the middle of the night, are thrown in the back of military jeeps, are beaten, and are thrown in Zionist prisons. And, right now we're looking at almost 4,000 people in administrative detention without charge or trial. We're looking at least 9,700 Palestinian prisoners inside the occupation jails. And that does not include the people that we were speaking about before, the Palestinian detainees from Gaza, whose numbers are not included in these statistics and in these numbers. We are The number may be larger than that. There was a letter that was written by an official of the Shin Bet claiming that there were 21,000 prisoners, and this is a number that was widely circulated, but the numbers that the Palestinian prisoners organizations have are around 9,700. But that doesn't mean that there aren't more, especially if we look at the numbers from Gaza, because those numbers have been completely obscured and no one has access to them except for the Zionist regime themselves. So what we're looking at is this ongoing use of mass incarceration against the Palestinian people, and that when Palestinian prisoners are being locked in jails, they are being brutalized. Again, not just in the military detention camps, but in the regular Zionist prisons. I mean, when we saw Moazzez Abayet, who last month, he was a bodybuilder. He was released from a Zionist prison after, I believe, 9 months in administrative detention from Beit Lahem. And when he went into prison as an athlete and a bodybuilder, and he came out and he wasn't able to walk and he was emaciated, we've seen detainee after detainee come out and tell their stories of, 10 men being given a cucumber to share for the day as their food. This is an ongoing attack against the Palestinian people. I mean, Itamar Ben Gvir, the fascist himself, is in charge of the Israel Prison Service. He's the person who's making the orders about the experiences that Palestinian prisoners are going to have. And of course, the conditions of detention aren't really the primary issue. The issue is detention itself, because Zionism has always used imprisonment, just pretty much like every other colonial project. It's always used imprisonment as a mechanism by which to stop the resistance. But the fact is that the Palestinian prisoners have built a movement, have built a Palestinian prisoners movement that has remained and is part and parcel of the resistance when we say things like prisoners are the compass of our struggle or the compass of our cause. When we say that prisoners are the conscience of the cause, this isn't just a kind of an idealistic vision. This is the fact that prisoners are constantly involved in a daily basis, not only in confronting the Zionist project with their bodies and their lives on the line, but in thinking, writing, writing literature, writing political content, doing everything they can, organizing study circles, as we always say, turning the dungeons of the occupier into revolutionary schools. This is what the prisoners movement has always done in the most extreme of circumstances. And so when we talk about the liberation of the prisoners, we're also talking about the liberation of revolutionary leadership from the Zionist regime prisons. And so this is a necessity, it's central. We can't imagine a free Palestine that doesn't involve dismantling the Zionist regime's prisons and emptying them. And again, this is the reason why the resistance was willing to take on such tremendous risks in order to liberate the prisoners, because time and time again, it has been proven that the only successful way to liberate prisoners from the Zionist regime is through a prisoner exchange. And this is true internationally as well. We just saw today a prisoner exchange with Russia when the US was having Canada hold Meng Wanzhou from China here in Canadian arrest. There was no way to end that other than to engage in a prisoner exchange. This has been shown time and time again. In dealing with imperialist powers, there is no way to achieve the liberation of prisoners except through achieving an exchange. And so every time that you hear this discussion of like, bring them home now or free the hostages, these aren't hostages, these are prisoners of war who are being detained by the resistance, and they could have been home on October 8th, 2023, because the resistance doesn't have any interest in kind of maintaining a hotel for Zionists. The resistance is interested in the liberation of Palestinian prisoners and the liberation of Palestinian land from the decades upon decades of torture and abuse that they are subjected to. And for that matter, we should note that even when Palestinians are martyred inside the occupation prisons, on many occasions the occupation retains their body and holds it as a prisoner until they've completed their sentence. From Sheikh Khadr Adnan to Walid Daqqa, the great freedom fighter and writer and thinker who was martyred inside Zionist prisons earlier this year, the Zionist regime is holding their bodies prisoner. There are hundreds of bodies of martyrs that are being held by the Zionist regime. So when we speak about the prisoners' movement, this is fighting this mechanism of imprisonment is part and parcel of how we stand with the resistance, because those who are imprisoned are those who resist in various forms. We're talking about students and teachers and workers and farmers, and we're talking about people who organize in their community, and of course we're talking about resistance fighters. And it's also important that we stand not just for the liberation of Palestinians held without charge or trial under administrative detention, but also those Palestinian prisoners that the Zionist entity is refusing to release in an exchange. The leading prisoners like Marwan Barghouti, like Ahmed Sadat, the general secretary of the PFLP, like Abdullah Barghouti and Abbas Syed and Ibrahim Hamid, Hamas leaders who are military leaders of the resistance. Abdullah Barghouti has essentially the longest prison sentence in the world due to it being 65 life sentences. So when we talk about the liberation of all Palestinian prisoners, we're talking about the liberation of all Palestinian prisoners, and that includes the political leaders and the military leaders of the Palestinian resistance. And this is part and parcel of the road toward victory and liberation for Palestine. And just to say also that, of course, we're doing this interview on August 1st, and so I'd be remiss to not discuss Black August in this context, and to say that the struggle of the Palestinian prisoners movement and the struggle of the Palestinian people is linked, is akin to, is connected to, through global anti-imperialist struggle to a fight against a common enemy with the Black liberation movement and the liberation of its political prisoners in the United States and internationally. And of course, members of the Palestinian prisoners movement, including Ahmed Sadat, who wrote a very powerful article and an introduction to an edition of Revolutionary Suicide that was published in France around 8 years ago, have spoken quite openly about calling for and seeing the Black liberation movement and Black liberation political prisoners in US jails as brothers and sisters of the movement for the liberation of Palestine. And certainly for those of us organizing in the United States, it's really important for us to support the freedom of the political prisoners of the liberation movements and the revolutionary movements that have been leading and advancing the cause here. And first and foremost among them certainly must be the political prisoners of the Black liberation movement.
Thank you for that. I mean, I was gonna make that point, and I think that you made it well. And I just dropped that because that's on your website too. The link to that article, the intro by Ahmed Sadat, so people can check that out. But I yeah, I mean, I think the Palestinian prisoner movement, and how how integrated it is within the liberation movement in Palestine, how it is seen as an integral part, and it is right. It's inextricable from that. That when we think about Black August and what it means, it is that as well, right? And maybe we're not in a phase right now where sometimes those connections can seem more distant, and people can feel like a lot of the prisoners that we lift up during Black August are people who were, you know, arrested that were radical in the 60s and 70s, maybe the early 80s, and so on. Um, there are, of course, a lot of political prisoners that, it is always a struggle uh, to bring into the conversation too, that have been arrested as a part of, liberation and protest activities in more recent years. I appreciate you mentioning the Holy Land 5, I think it is. Yeah, and obviously this was, as you mentioned, connected to support for, it was a charitable organization that was targeted for political repression during the Bush era. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's so many political prisoners, and I think that it's important for us to remember, obviously, folks like Mumia Abu Jamal, and many others, as we'll be having more conversations, I'm sure, during this month about Black August. Um, but to understand that connection too, of understanding it's not just that these people are political prisoners and that they've been repressed and that we want their freedom. Obviously, that's true, but we want to also, it's important to struggle for the leaders of movements and also for the movements that we have, whether it's the movement against Cop City, right, and all of the people who have been politically repressed around that, and so on, that these are people that are participating in our struggles, and we need to keep fighting for them, and that fight is a part of the struggle itself.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to follow up on one of the threads that you brought up the first time around, which was around the repression directed at the movement for Palestinian liberation. Now, of course, this is kind of a movement wide kind of repression that we see. For example, look at the attacks that the student intifada faced, the student uprising, the series of House committees and congressional hearings on the student movement, against the student movement, trying to criminalize it, the thousands upon thousands, I believe it was over 9,000 arrests carried out by police across the United States against student encampments and student movements organizing for the liberation of Palestine just a few months ago, and organizing to end the complicity of their own institutions in funding, investing in, and supporting genocide. Um, so that's been a huge part of the repression, and certainly and so I don't want to exceptionalize us as Samidoun, but we do have a particular experience with state repression that is taking place, I think, in many countries as well. Like for us, certainly one of the most dramatic examples has been in Germany, where, of course, the repression isn't confined to Samidoun, but essentially what we've seen is this really escalating level of repression. I mean, my husband, Caleb Barakat, and I were both deported from Germany 5 years ago because of our political activity around Palestine. And this was in the same year that Rasmia Oda was ordered deported from Germany and had a political ban imposed upon her for speaking about Palestine in Germany at an International Women's Day event. That was 3 months before Khaled had a political ban imposed upon him. In both cases, partially, it appears at the request of the US ambassador to Germany, who, when Khaled Khaled was going to speak about the Donald Trump's so-called deal of the century. At an Arab community center. And we know in the case of Rasmia that it was the US ambassador that intervened, that after from the United States, that there was an attempt to prevent her from speaking anywhere in the world as well. And now what we've seen is that now for the past 5 years, what we've been seeing is the banning of demonstrations on Nakba Day, the banning of demonstrations on Palestinian Prisoners Day, the banning of demonstrations on Al-Quds Day. Massive police raids and violence against the Palestinian Arab community. It's important to note that, like, Berlin, Germany is home to the largest single Palestinian community in all of Europe. So there is a really like massive campaign of repression that is targeted. I mean, when we talk about fascism in Germany, I really think people should look at Germany right now and what it is doing to the Palestinian community as a whole. This is a dangerous fascist state that is also the second largest supplier of arms to the Zionist regime after the United States. And so this is part and parcel also of like Germany's imperial reascendance as part of NATO, as part of really pushing the war drive against Ukraine. Ali Abunama was given a political ban against speaking at the Palestine Congress like a week or two ago. He recorded his speech and he posted it on YouTube, and it's great. It's online. People should watch it. But one of the reasons they gave wasn't even the usual Palestine reasons, but because you have helped to promote the Russian narrative about Ukraine by saying that Germany is helping to support Nazis in Ukraine. So they actually see these things as connected, and we should too. There's been this kind of misportrayal that there's the sense of German guilt about the Holocaust. This is not an expression of guilt. Uh, this is not what guilt looks like. Guilt does not look like finding another marginalized group to ban, persecute, harass, and demonize. This is actually the opposite of that. In fact, it's become the norm in German state political discourse to say that anti-Semitism is an imported problem by Muslims and Arabs. And so this kind of state philo-Semitism has become the order of the day, and it's just part and parcel of the German imperialist mythology about itself. And nothing separate from kind of the extent of German power and its major role in U.S.-led imperialism in the world today. And so, what that led to was in November of last year, Samidoun was officially banned. We were banned on the same day as Hamas, which I have to say was a striking estimation of our work, not necessarily what we would have expected. But this was mainly meant as a mechanism to frighten the Palestinian community from coming out to the streets, to try to scare people. In both the ban on Hamas and the ban on Samidoun, they labeled that "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" is a banned slogan. It's a banned slogan because it's associated with Hamas, and it's a banned slogan because it's associated with Samidoun. And like literally hundreds of people have been arrested in Germany for saying "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." That when people talk about the rules-based order, this is what it looks like. It looks like fascism, and it looks like absolutely no rights to freedom of expression. And yet we see time and time again, Zionist organizations calling for us to be listed as a terrorist entity in Canada or banned in the United States. And they say, well, it's because Germany banned them. Everyone should be looking at Germany as an example of what not to be, not as an example of what to be. This is a state where hundreds, if not thousands, of people have been arrested and detained over the past 10 months for protesting genocide. This is an example where there are dozens of Palestinian refugees, who are having their residency and their refugee status revoked because they participated in demonstrations for Palestine. Most of these cases are not taking place as so-called criminal charges. They're taking place in the immigration system in order to deport people. This is a country where people are being asked to state that they support Israel's right to exist in order to apply for citizenship. And of course, Israel's right to exist just means Zionism's right to exist. It means colonialism's right to exist. It means the Nakba was correct. So what they're asking Palestinians to sign on to is, and particularly Palestinians in Germany, who are most frequently refugees from Lebanon and Syria, who have been born refugees all of their lives and denied their right to return home. Do you believe that it was correct that you and your family have been forcibly displaced from your homeland for the past 76 years? Answer enthusiastically or you'll be deported. That's what Germany looks like today. Now, of course, this also stretched over to big tech. Hey, you can't find us on Instagram anymore because all of our accounts have been systematically deleted. The Israeli state declared us a terrorist organization in 2021. And this was in February 2021. It was a year in which they declared 10 kind of activist organizations. Some were NGOs, some were more kind of activist organizations as so-called terrorist organizations. And of course, again, this is mainly used as a weapon of intimidation to make it so, like, right now we can't get online donations because every single time we're able to set up a mechanism to get online donations, there's a flood of kind of Zionist letters and also letters directly from the Israeli embassy. I mean, in many of these cases, the Israeli embassy is directly intervening. Mohammed Khatib, the director of Samidoun in Europe, is facing an attempt to revoke his status as a refugee in the European Union. He's been born a refugee all of his life. He's born a Palestinian refugee in Ain al-Helwa camp in Lebanon. Because essentially the Israeli ambassador has submitted complaint after complaint about speeches, demonstrations, organizing, and writing for Palestine. The Israeli so-called cybercrime department wrote letters to our internet service providers, to our web hosts, to our social media accounts, to all of these places in an attempt to get us shut down, an attempt to get us silenced once and for all. That's what this isn't something that's just being done by kind of Zionist organizations or lobby organizations. This is a project that is being supported part and parcel by the Zionist state. And I mean, I know about the case of Samidoun in great detail because this is the organization that I work with, but we can certainly assume that we are not alone in this regard. This is the strategy that's being pursued, that there is a full-on counterinsurgency strategy being pursued against organizations that are mobilizing for Palestine. And that there's also an attempt here uh, to make us change the way that we organize and change the way that we speak. So there's this attempt to kind of create this sense that if we don't speak so much about the armed resistance, maybe all of this repression wouldn't happen to us. But then if we don't speak so much about the armed resistance, are we really fulfilling our obligation to the Palestinian prisoners? Many of those who have the longest sentences are doing so because they are organizers, leaders, and members of the armed resistance, let alone those are being the forces that are fighting for the liberation of Palestine. And it actually, the case of Germany, I think in a lot of ways really shows why it's important that we must all stand together against repression from the first case moving forward, because many times there is an attempt on the part of the state to create an illusion that, oh, we're just attacking these people because they're extremist in one way or another. But this won't affect you. This won't harm you as long as you stay away from talking about the resistance, as long as you stay away from speaking openly about those who are leading the struggle against Zionism and imperialism. As long as you don't talk about the resistance, you'll be safer. But that's not true. You won't be safer because all that happens then is that after they attack those who are speaking openly against the resistance, they just move on to the next target down the line. Because just as we see in occupied Palestine, the target is the entire movement. The target is the entire Palestinian people. The target is anyone who fights back against imperialism and Zionism. And so there is no safety to be found in adapting our organizing, our discourse, or our actions to the demands of the oppressor, to the demands of the genocidaire, and to the demands of the killer. The only way that we can confront them effectively is by all escalating our politics, our organizing, and our action to confront repression everywhere, and for all of us to stand collectively against these forms of attack rather than blaming each other for being attacked when the attacks come from our enemy. Because that united front is how we fight back, and it's how we build a worthwhile united front with the resistance organizations that are on the front lines leading the struggle. So, yeah, right now that means that we can't get online donations, that you can't find us on Instagram, that there's an attempt to make it so that you can't communicate. And this is a very small level of what we see being done against the resistance movements overall. When we talk about what does it mean to be listed as a so-called terrorist organization on in the United States, in the European Union, and Canada, it's not just, oh, they can't collect money. It's that it creates an entire sense of fear around these organizations, that people feel like you can't go to a meeting with these organizations because then you could be accused of coordination. And in Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, the Supreme Court held this idea of, coordination with resistance organizations as something that could be considered criminal behavior. And so there's an attempt fundamentally to disassociate any kind of solidarity movement, or for that matter as well. And this is a very important part, Palestinians in exile and diaspora being part of their liberation movement from the organizations and movements that are actually leading that liberation movement. And so I think it's really important. We as Samidoun think it's really important that we stand together to call for the immediate delisting of all of these resistance organizations from the so-called terror list. For that matter, scrapping the so-called terror list entirely. There is no mechanism in which the greatest perpetrators of terror in the world today, the United States, the European Union, and their imperialist allies, have any right or reason to designate organizations as terrorist. They are the perpetrators of terror in the world today. This list serves no purpose except to provide a mechanism of sanctions, mechanisms of siege, and mechanisms of economic, political, and criminal siege upon people who are struggling for liberation. So we have got to, we can't just be on the defensive when it comes to repression. We also have to go on the offensive. That means getting these organizations, getting the resistance organizations off the terror list, fighting against this criminalization, because the resistance organizations are, as we've been saying, those who are defending humanity right now, those who form the barrier between an attempted genocide and a completed genocide. It's the resistance that's doing that. So let's do everything we can, not just to fight back against the repression being designated at us directly, but against the entire mechanism that is allowing that repression to take place, which is the illegitimate designation of resistance organizations that are legitimate under international law, for that matter. Not that we should look at international law as like our bedrock or our horizon for the future. But it is important to note that this resistance is absolutely legitimate under international law, that resistance is not terrorism, that Zionism and colonialism and imperialism are terrorism, and that it is an honor to be associated with the organizations that are on this list. Of course, they will throw in reactionary organizations. Of course, they will throw in criminal groups. This is not surprising. This is actually designed to make it confusing for people, to design to, this whole campaign that the Zionists tried to promote, that Hamas is ISIS. This is part and parcel of the purpose of creating these confusing lists of organizations. But the fact is that the Palestinian resistance, Lebanese resistance, the Iraqi resistance, the Yemeni resistance, these are those who are sacrificing and giving the most. And these are those without whom we'd be speaking about a completed genocide and not just one that's in progress.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate you talking about that too, because I think there are all of these ways that, our movements can become divided, against themselves. And one of the ways that happens is by the use of these terrorism, the labels of terrorism statutes and laws that are on the books. And yeah, I mean, it does limit us in terms of the legal, frameworks around material support and things like that. But we need to stand with each other and support each other, and not allow uh, the forces of counterinsurgency to isolate, movements and organizations and individuals. And so I appreciate you sharing so much from what you all have dealt with at Samidoun related to that as well. Um, we've been going for about almost 2 hours now. How are you? I know you're always very busy. And so, I could ask another one for the audience, or we could close it out if you want to.
It's probably about time to wrap it up,
Yeah,
although it's
yeah,
been an amazing conversation, and I would love to be back, and also with our other comrade who,
yes.
due to some events happening in Venezuela, was unable to be with us today. But we would love to continue this conversation in the future. And I also just wanted to recommend we have a video on our website of a great panel discussion that was conducted between activists in Samidoun or in the Masar Badil, the Palestinian Alternative Revolutionary Path movement, about repression in Europe in different countries. It's a great kind of comparative and analytical approach. So check that out on our website as well.
Awesome. Yes, please go to sammydune.net and check out all of the resources, work, analysis that you all have. There are ways there for people if they want to send you a physical check that they can also
Yes.
support your organization. And I think that's important to note because you can't receive digital donations. So that's always supported or always good if you're able to do that. And so yeah, thank you, Charlotte, so much for this. Thank you for taking all of this time and for all of what you had to say. This was really, I think, refreshing, especially given that we were talking about some stuff that could be really brutal to talk about, but your ability to talk about it and also combine it with inspiration, with mobilization, with the kind of clarity that we need. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And again, it's always an honor to be with you.
All right, thank you.